Okay, so picking up where I left off, um, yes, the Spanish were not best pleased with the Scottish arriving in Darien. They were very active, as I say, they were colonizing parts of Central and South America. They had actually occupied Darien 200 years before, but they had abandoned the area for the reasons that I stated before, because it was near a swamp, there were all these illnesses, there was uh, thick forest, there were all these problems. So they had no interest really in Darien, in settling Darien, but they still wanted access to it. So but they also didn't attack the Scottish directly. They didn't want to kill the Scottish, and they were actually working along with King William of England at the time. The English were very reluctant to get involved for a number of reasons. As I said before, they saw this project as being in competition with their own projects, and they also didn't want to encourage the Scottish, because they thought if the Scottish do well on this project, then they might branch out and might try to colonize other areas. But the English definitely didn't want problems with the Spanish. They didn't want to get into a war with the Spanish because of the Scottish venture. But they also didn't actively help the Scottish. So eventually the Spanish arrived on the island and imprisoned some of the Scottish people. And 9 months after the original expedition set off, or rather 9 months after they arrived at Darien, Patterson decided to return to Scotland. But here's where the whole venture becomes absurd. The messages that the settlers in Darien were sending back to Scotland didn't really reflect the reality. They didn't want to send alarm bells ringing. They didn't want to say, oh my God, we're having a terrible time, we have no food and we don't know what we're doing. No, so the messages that were sent back were quite optimistic or maybe euphemistic. Oh yes, there are a few challenges, but everything's going okay. So as a result of that, a second boat set off to Darien. And they actually arrived after the first boat had arrived back. Because it took such a long time, it took 4 months, the second lot of people arrived, and of course they were expecting to meet lots of people, they thought it would be very prosperous, they thought there'd be lots of buildings, that everything would be great, but actually they got there and they saw that nothing had been done, that there was still a lot of thick forest, and most terrifyingly of all, they saw that there were lots of graves, there were lots of recently dug graves. So you can imagine the scene when these poor people arrive, thinking they're arriving at this sort of El Dorado, and they get there and all they see is death, destruction, no prosperity, no buildings, nothing. So in total, 3,000 Scottish people set off for Darien between the first exhibition and the second exhibition. And between 1,500 and 2,000 people died either in Darien or on the journey. So you can see that it was a complete disaster for Scotland in general. And up until then, Scotland was united under the same king as England, but it wasn't actually part of the United Kingdom at that stage. That happened really as a result of the Darien disaster. The English ended up bailing out the Scottish. They paid £400,000 to get the Scottish out of this mess. But it really meant that the Scottish were embarrassed. It was a failure. It was a failure financially. It was a political failure. It was a reputational failure. And several years later, they signed an agreement with England in 1707, which led to what's now the United Kingdom. So you might be thinking, oh, this is wonderful, what an interesting historical tale. You might be thinking, when is he going to shut up? But it does have some relevance to our life today. Especially in Scotland, you'll know that in 2014 there was the Scottish independence referendum. And this whole idea of Darien was brought up then. It was actually used by both sides of the campaign. So it was used by the pro-independence campaign as, the need for vision and courage, and yes, let's be ambitious and let's work together as Scottish people. And it was also used by the unionist side, the people who were against independence. They were saying, we need to be careful, we need to be cautious, we need to put practical concerns ahead of ideology. So you can see that Darien still has resonance for Scottish people today. I think possibly the same thing could be said for Brexit, that there's a degree of ideology above research and thinking about practical matters. I mean, in retrospect, it was definitely a failure. I think it was down to bad planning and a lack of knowledge about the place. But I do admire the Scottish for trying to be a little bit entrepreneurial and trying to think outside the box. Even though my thoughts on colonialism, I'm obviously not too keen on colonialism. But anyway, so as I say, Darien still has an impact on the Scots today, and it is something that we might hear about again, because chances are there will be another referendum on Scottish independence in our lifetimes for sure. It could arrive within the next few years, or it might be a little bit further off, we don't quite know. But anyway, now you know about the Scottish colonial venture of Darien. Thank you very much for your attention.